All right, so let's get started. Chapter 2. Uh, there's different ways of referring to these things. They can be landform regions, physiographic regions, or structural zones. These three get used interchangeably. Now, there are three uh, landform regions, physiographic regions, or structural zones that can explain the bulk of the geography of South America. And I think the first potential test question asks, what are those three? And here they are. They're the Eastern Highlands, the Central Lowlands, and the Western Alpine system. And I'm going to repeat that like 20 times. So don't feel bad if you didn't write it down right now. Here you can see it visually. If we look at South America, they're the Eastern Highlands. They are three separate highlands that are not connected. And so those are the Eastern Highlands, the Central Lowlands in the center, and then the Western Alpine system, essentially the Andes Mountains on the west coast of South America. And so now we'll start to break down the Eastern Highlands first. So it turns out that each one of these Eastern Highlands has its own name. The northernmost Eastern Highland is known as the Guiana Highlands. Then the one in the center is the Eastern Highland in the center is called the Brazilian Highlands. And then the southernmost of the Eastern Highlands are the Patagonian Plateau. So there's, again, the three major structural zones. The Eastern Highlands are three separate entities, each one of them with their own name: Guiana, Brazilian, and Patagonian Plateau. And here we see them again in color. And again, Eastern Highlands break down into Guiana, Brazilian Highlands, and Patagonian Plateau. A lot of repetition. Hopefully that helps you get the information. And again, I do share this PowerPoint on Canvas. Now we look into a little bit more detail into each one of those Eastern Highlands, starting with the northernmost, the Guiana Highlands. One noteworthy thing about them is this is where you can find Angel Falls. Angel Falls are the world's highest uninterrupted waterfall. They are in Venezuela. And they're also the inspiration for the Disney movie Up, when the man goes to Paradise Falls, or always wanted to go to Paradise Falls. And there's also this YouTube, I don't know what to call it. A YouTube link where you can like control
anteaters, iguanas, parrots, colibris, and other
control the view.
Flora is represented by
Whoops.
300 species of
So it's pretty cool. 360 degrees Angel Falls, Airpano VR. In case you want to check that out. All right, now we break down a little bit more the Eastern Highlands in the middle, the Brazilian Highlands. Uh, they break up into the Mato Grosso Plateau, and then the interior sedimentary zone itself gets broken down into the Sertão in the north and the Paraná Plateau. I'm sorry, Sertão in the north, Paraná Plateau in the south. And yeah, and then the third part is the Serra do Mar, also known as the Great Escarpment. And something noteworthy there is in the Paraná Plateau is Iguazu Falls. Iguazu Falls are taller and twice as wide as Niagara Falls. It is the world's largest waterfall system. As mentioned in the previous slide, has 275 falls, and they are shared by Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay. All right. Now, the southernmost of the Eastern Highlands, the Patagonian Plateau, and they're they're associated most with Argentina. And did I get rid of something here? No, we'll get to it later, I think. Huh. Well, one of the things. Oh, okay, okay. Sorry. Yeah, I'll save it for later. All right. So I don't really add much to Patagonian Plateau other than Argentina, which should be pretty obvious. Okay, moving on to the second of the structural zones. That is the central lowlands. And very literal, they're in the center and they are lower. And so that's where water goes to, and you get the things you would expect with water descending into valleys and so forth. The central lowlands are broken up into these four different areas. There is the Llanos in the north, the Amazon basin just south of that, followed by the Gran Chaco, and then southernmost, the Pampas. And I'll talk a little bit about each one of these four right now. So the Llanos, the northernmost, they're associated with the Orinoco River. They're in Colombia and Venezuela. This is an area known for being good, having good soil for agriculture. They have savannas, and it is one of the parts of the Americas that has a long history of cowboy culture. A lot of times we're not aware that the US Southwest is not the only place in the world that had cowboy culture, but because of Hollywood, we've disseminated the impression that we're the only ones, and disseminated that information to the world. But the Llanos of Colombia and Venezuela is an area known for its cowboy culture. And by the way, with regard to the US Southwest, that cowboy culture was learned from Mexico before it became associated with the United States. Just a picture of the Orinoco River, a map of the Orinoco and additional pictures. And all right, moving on to the second one. South of the Llano is the Amazon basin. And there are lots of rivers that feed into the Amazon River. And it's all surrounded by the Amazon rainforest. The the Amazon River runs uh, east or a little bit northeast. And let's see here. Uh, Countries that have rivers that feed the Amazon. We have Colombia, Venezuela, maybe it's right on the border. Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia. They all have rivers that feed into the Amazon. More details about the Amazon. It is 3/4 the size of the United States. It is the greatest reserve of biodiversity in the world. It has 20% of the world's available fresh water. It is the largest continuous stretch of tropical rainforest. And it is the greatest carbon sink on Earth. In the Amazon rainforest, you can find, there are 170 Native American or indigenous cultural groups. And we'll learn more about those later on. Like I mentioned, the Amazon runs east, and all of these countries feed into it. Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Bolivia, Peru, and then obviously Brazil. So yeah, when we go more in depth into different countries and some of their policies, this idea of the greatest carbon sink becomes interesting because countries that have the rainforest, who are an important carbon sink for the planet, um, they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place because on the one hand, they want to become more developed and industrialized, but on the other hand, they also don't want to destroy the rainforest and get rid of that carbon sink that's important to the whole planet. And so they're one thing that they've tried to do is try to encourage the biggest carbon producers in the world to help them preserve it as but and so yeah, we'll get more into examples like that of them trying to figure out what to do in their situation. All right, south of the Amazon is the Gran Chaco, and not really much information there other than it tends to be on the dry side. So not much for Gran Chaco. And then we get to the Pampas. These are plains with grassland. They're associated mostly with Argentina, but they also stretch into a bit of Brazil and Uruguay. They're known for fertile soils, and they have a long history of cattle ranching and sheep herding. And so Argentina is another place, or this area, the Pampas, with Argentina and a little bit of Brazil and Uruguay, is another part of the Americas with a very long history of cowboy culture. Here they call their cowboys, they call them gauchos. All right. Now moving on to the third structural zone, the Western Alpine system. Like I mentioned before, it's essentially the Andes Mountains. This one is a little different in that it's not like this part of the Andes is called this and that part of the Andes is called that. There's the Andes that stretch the whole way, and then within the Andes, you can find these three enclaves. I'll go into greater detail into each one of those four. So the Andes Mountains, going from north to south along the west coast of South America. The Andes Mountains are located in Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. So all along the west coast of South America, starting with Venezuela and all the way down to Argentina. One noteworthy thing about the Andes is that they have the Aconcagua Peak. The Aconcagua Peak is the highest peak in the Americas, north or south. It is in Argentina, although it is very close to the border with Chile. All right. The Altiplano is the name of a plateau that is between two ranges of the Andes. There's the eastern range and the western range. And in the middle is this plateau that is very at a high elevation. This altiplano is shared by the countries of Bolivia and Peru, and a little bit of Chile, you can see here. And in the altiplano, you can find two additional things. One is Lake Titicaca, this lake that is shared by Bolivia and Peru. And then there are these salares, kind of like salt lakes. So the Altiplano is the name of the plateau. And then in that plateau, you can find Lake Titicaca in the north and these salt lakes or salares in the south. A little bit more detail regarding Lake Titicaca. Like mentioned before, it's in the Altiplano. It is shared by Peru and Bolivia. It is the world's highest lake that is navigable by large vessels. In fact, Bolivia, who does not have access to the ocean, is landlocked. They have a navy that is only on Lake Titicaca. I'm not going to quiz you on the elevation. It's 12,500 feet. And till this day, it has a very long indigenous history, indigenous presence. Lake Titicaca that is still very visible and present today. And for Native American peoples of the Altiplano, they thought of Lake Titicaca as being the center of the world. And so for them, that was the center of the world. These salt lakes or these salares in the Altiplano, Most of them are in Bolivia, but yeah, the salares are in Bolivia, and they don't get a lot of rain, but when they do, you could see here how incredible they look, reflecting the sky. Now, Bolivia is one of the poorest countries in Latin America. And they're in this interesting situation. And again, we'll talk more about this later, but introduce you to it. They're in this interesting situation where they have between 50 and 70% of the world's lithium. And as you might be aware, lithium is an important mineral for modern batteries that we use in cell phones, computers, electric vehicles, etc. And so this poor country is in a situation where they have something the world wants. And so they've been trying to balance between, you know, benefiting, making money, um, but not doing it in just, what's the word? Haphazardly or irresponsibly. And so, like, they've been trying to have the government play a role, uh, Bolivian companies play a role, so that it's not just multinational foreign companies coming in, extracting everything, paying them a pittance, and destroying their environment in the process. But this has gotten a little bit more complicated because then uh, neighboring countries, Peru and Chile, uh, have also found lithium uh, under their soil, and they have not been as careful, and so they've been kind of undercutting Bolivia's efforts to try to do things more environmentally responsible and that kind of thing. So that's one example of the kinds of things they're dealing with. Further south of the Altiplano in Chile, you can find the Atacama Desert. It is the driest place on Earth. To give you a sense, it rains about once every 10 years. And so there they have to come up with creative ways of getting water. And one example of those is they set up nets to catch like the morning dew and then get water that way. Or fog, I call it too. This was not included uh, as one of the four specific things to look for uh, in the Western Alpine system, but I bring it up anyways. There's the presence of fjords in Chile, where just can be very helpful to know. Again, one of the best examples of not being a desert or a rainforest environment. They have glaciers, they have fjords that cut through the landscape. When we see Chile on a map, it could just look like a solid landmass, but in fact, there are kind of like cruises that you can take where these big ships are, kind of going through the fjords. And so actually, it looks more like a ton of islands in southern Chile. All right. Now moving on to some other things about Latin American geography. And so here we're looking at things like plate tectonics, and I'll talk about all these. The Ring of Fire, earthquakes, and volcanoes. All right, so here we're looking at the plates of the Earth and how they coincide in the Americas, where you have the Pacific Plate off of California, the Cocos Plate off of Mexico and Central America, the Caribbean Plate in the Caribbean Sea, the Nazca Plate for most of the west coast of South America, Antarctic, um, and then the rest of South America being on the South American plate. Um, yeah. And so you have these plates, and these plates are either crashing into each other or spreading apart. And it so happens the Nazca plate and the South American plate are crashing together. And so then that results in earthquakes. This also results in the creation of magma, which leads to volcanoes, which leads to mountains, hence the Andes, and lots of volcanoes. Here's a different view of the plates being merged together, and the creation of earthquakes and volcanic activity. I'll play for you briefly a video version to help illustrate this. Let's see.
Happens because hot rock rises, heated by the Earth's core. Near the surface, the rock spreads in two directions and goes sideways. It begins to lose heat. Eventually, the much cooler rock sinks back down. Through this spreading process, the Earth's crust is very slowly dragged apart. And it's this that ultimately causes the continents to move. Where the plates collide, the rock on the seafloor containing carbon from the dead plankton is carried deep into the earth. As it descends, this layer of rock is heated, so the rock melts, releasing carbon dioxide. And gas is returned back into the atmosphere during an eruption.
Okay. So yeah, that it helps to explain why there's lots of volcanoes and mountains and earthquakes on the west coast of the Americas. But it turns out that it's not just in the Americas. This makes a huge ring all around the Pacific Ocean, making its way to Asia and then over to the Americas. And so that's what's referred to as the Ring of Fire. So there's many volcanoes in Latin America. Many of them are close to populated areas. Now, one of the paradoxes we'll learn about is that, if we see the the volcano erupting and the magma spewing out. That's obviously dangerous. Why would people want to choose to live so close to volcanoes? Well, it's volcanoes aren't erupting all the time. They erupt, um, they tend to erupt every, I don't know, generation or so. But they help create fertile soil surrounding the area. And so close to volcanoes tend to be the best areas for growing things, for agriculture. And so hence people live there and grow things and populations accumulate nearby. The earthquakes, again, another way that helps us see the Ring of Fire is the earthquakes. And there's this website that shows you what earthquakes happened today and how strong they are. What earthquakes happened yesterday, in the past 2 weeks, and the last 5 years. And that's another thing, if you don't live in an area that has earthquakes, you may not be aware that earthquakes happen all the time. It's just that we only hear about earthquakes when there's a big one, but there's actually earthquakes all the time on a regular basis happening. And so, yeah, there's this website, iris.edu, where you can, look up what earthquakes are happening now or happened recently and how big were they. And so, yeah, here you can see how the mapping of the earthquakes helps us map out the plates. Just, yeah. All right. So here we get into a comparison, and we'll be coming back to this example. It's a comparison of two earthquakes that both happened in Latin America in 2010. They were both large. The one that hit Haiti was 7.0 on the Richter scale. The one that hit Chile was much larger, 8.8 on the Richter scale. I mean, that's about as strong as an earthquake as I've ever heard of anywhere ever. But there's other factors. It's not just how strong was it, but how well off is the country. Haiti is the poorest in the Caribbean and arguably certainly one of the poorest in Latin America. So they had, they're a poor country. Chile, on the other hand, we may think of Latin America as being all poor, uh, you know, but actually Chile and other countries are economically pretty strong. And it varies. They go through their ups and downs as well. But Chile is one of the wealthiest. And so there were over 200,000 deaths in Haiti. In Chile, there were 600 deaths. What helps explain this? Well, Chile, being a financially better off country, has better, what's the word? Has better regulations for the building and building codes for structures so that everything is built to withstand earthquakes. Whereas in Haiti, being a poor country, things are built more without following a lot of regulations to protect them from earthquakes. And so Haiti ended up having more damage. Yet in Chile, it costs 3 times more to rebuild. And so even though Chile suffered less damage, it costs 3 times more to rebuild because they're rebuilding to a different standard than in Haiti. And so, yeah, just some of the factors, looking at some of the factors and, why they can end up with very different results or impacts. All right, moving on from South America to Middle America, Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. For Mexico, Mexico has a lot of mesas and uh, mountain ranges and volcanoes. So they're mountain ranges, they call them sierras. And sierra means like saw, like a saw with all the peaks to cut with. And so there's the Western Sierra Madre, there's the Eastern Sierra Madre, and then in the center, there's the two mesas. There's the Mesa del Norte and the Mesa Central. Just south of all that is a line of volcanoes right through the center of Mexico, close to Mexico City. And then south of that is more mountains, the Southern Highlands. And so, yeah, an introduction to the geography of Mexico. Um, Now let's look at some of those volcanoes. There's volcanoes all over the place, although mainly, right through the center here. You can see almost a straight line. And these mountains and these volcanoes, you know, do there's a lot of those mountains and volcanoes that regularly have snow on them. And so, another thing we may not associate with Mexico, places with snow. In Central America, lots of volcanoes, especially again on the western coast. Here's a picture of one volcano with kind of a stereotypical shape, just one peak by itself. And that volcano, the Momotombo, is very close to a large population, to one of the larger cities in Nicaragua, a city called León, like lion. This is downtown León, Nicaragua, and from downtown León, you can see that peak of the Momotombo, to give you an idea of how close it is. Another geographic feature of uh, the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, and connecting into the Caribbean and into South America is these limestone plains. Um, so these are areas where the topsoil is pretty shallow. And so then, and if you might recall, this area is the area where the Mayan people, well, no, I haven't lectured on it yet, but it's southern Mexico and Central America is the area where the Mayans had large cities and populations. And so one of the questions has been, how were they able to sustain such large cities when they have such a shallow topsoil that couldn't sustain that? And part of the answer is that these limestone plains create sinkholes. And then the Mayans found creative ways of using the sinkholes for agriculture to be able to sustain large populations. And so yeah, and these limestone plains, are both in Central America and the Caribbean. And so yeah, they you can see how some of these island chains uh, seem to be connected to one another. Almost part of like underground mountain ranges, not underground, underwater mountain ranges. And also part of what I like about maps like these is that a lot of times when we look at a map of North America and South America, the a lot of the Caribbean isn't in the map, and it makes it seem like there's these incredible distances between these different places, like Florida and Cuba and Mexico. Whereas when you look at all these islands, you can see how uh, Native Americans hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago, it wasn't all that, they didn't have to travel a lot of distance to be able to island hop throughout the Caribbean. And again, how close they are to one another. Cuba, or look at Key West to Cuba, or the Yucatan Peninsula, Cancun to Cuba. But yeah, we'll get more into that later. And again, you're going to be tested there's going to be a map component to the first test where you need to know, you don't have to know these cities. You need to know these countries. You need to know all the Greater Antilles. Um, you just need to know the Bahamas in general and the Lesser Antilles in general. All right. Another point regarding the Lesser Antilles is that there's an inner arc and an outer arc of Lesser Antilles. The inner arc is the one that is geologically younger, and so that's the one that has volcanoes that are still active. The outer arc is geologically older, and what the volcanoes that created them are not active.